let me transition, John, back to the first question I
Yeah.
asked. Try to redeem your impression of me in the next 16 minutes, and before I ruin your day completely. The first question I asked was, so one thing that's special about you, Jonathan, is that you have this unique ability to not just see patterns but understand them, not just understand them, but understand their global significance and how patterns exist through time and what we can glean from them. And so the first and really the only question I asked before I dove us into this debate was, why are symbols important? And you were explaining how multiplicity transitions into unity through purpose and pattern. What do you mean by that? What does that mean, multiplicity, and what does that mean, unity? Can you explain that a bit?
Well, so this is people like, okay, so this is a million things, like
Yeah.
millions and millions of things. But it's also one thing, which is a cup, right? And the reason why I see it as a cup is because I can see its purpose. And that purpose unites the multiplicity into one and makes me care about it, care about the unity
Yeah.
of the multiplicity. And that's true, obviously, at a basic level like this, but it's also true at higher levels, which is the ones that are harder to see, which are, for example, like how a family is one thing, how a city is one thing, how a nation is one thing, how a team is one thing, a company. All of these things unite multiplicity into unity through purpose.
Yeah. Got it. And that's so where another question I have is, you've done a lot of talks, you've created a lot of videos. What do you think is one idea of yours that people still don't grasp?
One of the things that people still don't grasp, in the end, it is this question, which you could call vertical integration, or you could call, this fractal notion of unity and multiplicity, and its relation to purpose and how it leads into the notion of, like, the idea that intelligence is a mode of constraint on lower beings, and that people tend to see that true, all the way up to humans. But as soon as you jump up from there, then people they start. It's like as if it's not possible, right? It's like it is possible for me through intelligence to constrain reality below me, but it's difficult for people to understand how intelligence constrains them. And that's why they struggle to make the jump into the idea of higher forms of intelligence, right?
Can you help me understand that? How when you say intelligence can constrain you, whether it's below or above, can you help me understand that?
So let's try to explain it as simply as possible. So you could use the word intelligence.
Yeah.
It's difficult because the word intelligence today has kind of lost a little bit of the meaning that it had in the ancient world, but you could use the idea of purpose. I like the idea of purpose is a better one, right? So intelligible purpose maybe is a good way to think about it, right? The ancients talk about logos, right? Or so reason, purpose, intelligibility, all of that goes together, right? And so that is the only way that you can constrain multiplicity towards one, right? Especially in living systems. Like it's harder to see at lower levels, but as soon as you have things that are autopoietic, that is, that kind of have a form of self-preservation, you could say, then that's how it functions. And so a good example would be, what's the difference between a crowd of strangers and a group? And the answer is always purpose. It's always common purpose, common attention, right? And so there's something which is pulling us into unity, and that is what makes us one. And that unity has to be related to intelligence and constrains the group, right? It constrains it into unity. And so, right, that's how teams function, that's how companies function. So no matter how you think. So it's like, why are we a company? Because we're making robots. That's the unitive thing that brings us together towards purpose and makes us see each other as being part of one thing instead of just being strangers that don't interact with each other. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Wow. Thank you. And you were, I think, the first icon carver I've ever met. How did you become an icon carver? How did that journey start, and what inspired you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it has to do with, I mean, in some ways, it has to do with the whole question that I asked myself. And so, the idea that I'm an icon carver, I find it at this point, it's become a little funny because I actually don't carve icons anymore. But it's funny how that became to be like the identity that sticks to me. I think I should just embrace it. But in some ways, what it has to do is to understand that the things that I do have to be connected vertically. And so if I was going to make art, it had to be embedded into higher forms of meaning and higher forms of participation. So the great thing about making art for churches in a religious context is that you're making an object that is aimed towards the highest possible goal and that is also given to participate within a community. And so it has a language that the community recognizes, and then that language is leading you up to a higher good. And so that's how I see the world. And I want that to not just be something that I think about, but something that I actually do. And so the icon carving is part of it. But I would say pretty much all the things that I do, hopefully, are manifesting that vision of reality, at the different level. So it's different from, the idea that artists express themselves and that artists make art for art's sake. Like, to me, that's a form of modern breakdown, you could say, right? It seems to participate in a kind of fragmentation, whereas all the traditional arts, they were rather seen as, so the word art means well fitted together, right? The Latin word for art. And what it means is that you take a bunch of multiplicity, right? So I take stones and I take my skill and I take tools and I take a thing and I join them together towards a purpose. And that's what art is. And that's why art and techne are actually, technology are actually, in the ancient world, they were the same thing, because it's like I'm gathering things together towards a purpose. And in my case, it's towards worship of God, which I think is the highest possible goal or the highest possible good.
And people, I think, in this increasing polarization in our society, can probably benefit from understanding this sort of symbolism and archetypes. Do you think that an understanding and an appreciation of symbolism and archetypes can help us bridge ideological divides?
Definitely. Well, also because, so for example, again, like multiplicity and unity, let's say you have something that's multiple and it moves towards unity, but it also has to move towards multiplicity. You have to have a kind of breathing in and breathing out for beings to exist. So for a being to exist, you need it to be aligned with its identity, but you also need it to be flexible enough to allow flexibility, like to have some flexibility in its instantiation, right? So, right. So it's like a cup has a single identity, but that identity has to be flexible enough to account for the fact that all cups are different, right? And so if you want to understand that, it's like that is the right and the left in politics. And so you have in politics a desire to manifest unity and a desire to manifest identity and a desire to like bring everybody together towards a single purpose. And that has great aspects to it, but it also has dangers to it. And then you have an aspect which wants to show variability and to feature difference and to feature how we're not the same, how we're different, how we have to also be free to some extent from the authority that is holding us together. And so what happens is, if we can't understand the need for both, right, that there is always a need for unity and variation, that what happens is you have this fight. And so you have people saying open borders, and then someone saying, no, put a wall, right? It's like this. And so there's someone saying, what is it that Justin Trudeau says? He says, diversity is our strength. And then you have someone who says America first, right? And so it's like, or Canada first, right? So it's like, you can see that one is saying identity, one we need something to bind us together. And the other is saying, well, watch out, that binding might be too severe. So we also need to express variability. And so what symbolism, an aspect of symbolism is always the capacity to play or to see between those two aspects of a being, how there is the pattern and then there's also the variation on the pattern. And without that, then we're stuck in a war between the two sides.
So how do you, with your perspective as an icon carver and a symbolism expert, right? How do you see and interpret these stark political, ideological differences that are happening? Like, what's going on?
Well, it has to do in some ways with the lack of normal hierarchy, like in terms of perception, in terms of participation. Whereas, one of the things that has happened since the Enlightenment, especially, is the idea that we have to free ourselves from types of authority. We have to free ourselves from religion. We have to free ourselves from state. We have to free ourselves from this and that, from the king, from all these things. And so what that leads to is forms of idiosyncrasy, right? So it's like we need to free ourselves and now we have idiosyncrasy. But that idiosyncrasy, the world actually has to be a balance of the two. So once you have things moving towards idiosyncrasy, what it does secretly is that it calls for tyranny at the same time. So it's like, think about it. It's basically like saying, if I start to rebel against the police, then what happens? Then the police become stricter, right? And so as things move into fragmentation, then the authority and the power and the unity imposes itself more strongly. And so that's what happens. You see it split. And then, of course, you can understand, once it starts to split and it stops dancing, then both are right. Because on the one hand, you have the police that used to be like Joe, from that I grew up with, that I went to high school with, and is now like the local sheriff, to basically an armed SWAT team with semi-automatics that is wearing stuff on over their face that I don't even see them, who is now coming in, to break up the riot. And so you can see like this split where you have these two extremes manifesting themselves together. And so that's the problem, is that the dance was broken. And once the dance is broken, it's very difficult once the pendulum starts swinging, it's really hard to slow it down. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult to slow it down.
When you say dance, what do you mean by dance?
What I mean is it's like breathing in and breathing out, right? You can't just breathe in. You can't just breathe out.
So what?
You have to move. So there's a beautiful poem by Rumi, who's a Sufi poet, who talks about, he says, if you keep the hand always open, if you keep the hand always closed, you're paralyzed. But he said, life is the gentle opening and closing of the hands, like the wings of a butterfly. Like that is the movement between unity and multiplicity. It's a kind of dance where you're careful not to go too far into one to the other.
Is the lesson there that we should all be more flexible in understanding the full picture and not holding so tightly to our preconceptions? Is that part of the message, perhaps?
I mean, to have a larger perception, maybe, like to be able to perceive the reason, at least perceive the reason for my enemy. Right. It not means that you have to agree with your enemy, but it's like to perceive the reason for why my enemy is acting the way they are in political terms. I think that could be very helpful.
Yeah. Absolutely. Final question. What do you hope that people can learn or understand about symbolism? If there's one thing, what do you want people to know or appreciate?
Well, I would say I hope that people who feel like their lives are meaningless and that they're wandering and that they don't have direction can acquire some insight into how, in fact, the world lays itself out with meaning and purpose and beauty, and that it can give them a direction and hope.
Awesome. John, thanks so much for your time. I'm going to end the recording and then